Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining our webinar today. Today is really an exploration of how we return to the workplace in a safe way and also a way that encourages placemaking and connection to place by those coming back to the workplace environment. So we wanted to go through some strategies both for the built environment itself and how users find their way through the built environment, as well as some of the policies and technologies that can help with this transition back, not only for the post-COVID times, but also just taking a look at the future workplace in general.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Cristina, for introducing us. I'm Amy. I am joining in from New York, and I currently work at Plastarck as a Sociospatial Designer. And I'm really excited to talk about the intersection of wellness and workplace with Cristina from a number of lenses.
Yeah. And I'm Cristina. I'm from Entro. I'm an associate there, and I also work on brand and well strategy, and coming in from Vancouver today. So first, just to give you a background of our companies. So Entro is a wayfinding and experiential graphic design firm. This is our team. We're a nice big interdisciplinary team. We have architects, interior designers, industrial designers, brand strategists like me. We even have a cognitive neuroscientist. So we look at wayfinding and place branding from a number of perspectives and really try to take a comprehensive view into how people connect to their environments. And really all of our work at the end of the day goes into creating overall place brands and place understanding. We were established over 50 years ago, and we have offices all over the world: Sydney, Toronto, Calgary, Vancouver, New York, and Zurich. And our team is growing. I think we're even at almost 60 at this point. So, and as I mentioned, kind of where we sit in the environmental graphic design kind of diagram here is in the center. We do wayfinding, which involves how we understand our environment. We also work in branded environments, so how the brand or vision of an organization or company can really be translated to that space. And then marketing and communications as well, mostly from the place branding point of view. So it's really anything that's involved in communicating place. And our philosophy is really, as I mentioned before, about connecting people, giving places identity and meaning, create design that's not only beautiful, but really practical and strategic. And at the end of the day, really changing everyday experiences into ones that can be inspirational, whether it be walking down the street, walking into work in this case. We really just want to elevate those everyday experiences.
Yeah, and Plastarck, on the other hand, is a little bit different. We are a design consultancy focused on workplace strategy. We are a work from anywhere company, so we have different employees all around the world at the moment. And our philosophy or our mission that drives our work is we believe that you can make the world a better place, one workplace at a time. And so we do that through a number of different ways. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see our 4 core business areas. At our core, we focus on workplace strategy, which includes data analysis and high-touch engagement. But then we also have an expertise in change leadership and change management, which spills into some of our executive education and research work, which are both continuously ongoing. And we're frequently trying to challenge our own thought leadership with partners like Entro. Something that we're really proud of is how much our clients not only drive our work, but engage within our processes. So here you'll see a few different select clients that we've been working with over the past few years. Our sectors range from finance to pharmacy and pharma and tech and all the way to the government. And currently we're working in perhaps the most interconnected and interdisciplinary lens at the moment with government, tech, and perhaps even manufacturing. Something that really is perhaps the most critical to our engagements is always how interdisciplinary we strive to be. Our team itself is comprised of individuals ranging from architecture and design all the way over to social sciences and psychology and human factors. And we really exist at the intersection of all of these as we approach all different types of support systems within the workplace. These can include people, technology, and space, and how they all talk to one another within this environment. And then finally, something that might be new for you, but hopefully isn't too out there, is this notion that maybe the metrics we use to define the workplace and really just the built environment might need to transition in order to better suit the users as opposed to the space. So as opposed to shifting or focusing on building metrics like cost per square feet and square foot per person and other things that are more space-based, at Plastarck, we rely on people metrics that really showcase what we're trying to achieve and how the occupants interact with the space or interact with the culture, whether that be ergonomics, connection, accessibility, interaction, transparency, or even communication and brand expression. And those really enable us to leverage our expertise and showcase what the workplace can be beyond just what it is. So all in all, data informs our work, but it also more importantly informs people-centric workplace and urban transformation. This is something that we advocate for continuously, and I know you'll see it throughout today's presentation. So I'll hand it back to Cristina.
Thank you. So you can see why it's great for companies like ours to be talking to each other. Often working with teams like this help us really understand the objectives of the workplace more from, as Amy mentioned, a human-centered point of view, understanding how we can actually make people work differently in the workplace, enjoy their time there, and how it affects their mental health and wellness, which we'll get into a little bit later. But it's important that firms like ours don't work in silos and that we do talk to each other, so that feedback loop continuously, continues to feed itself, really. So really what we wanted to take you first through is how the workplace has evolved, because this isn't just a reaction to COVID. Workplaces have always been changing, they're constantly evolving, and they will evolve. And really what we feel has happened is that COVID has just accelerated a lot of these trends already. Of course, there will be specifics for the short-term COVID recovery, but it's really part of a larger movement. And we've seen as workplaces shift over time into ones that maybe we're trying to get the most per square footage and really fit everything in. And then we see them evolve to more open spaces that allow for communication and difference in one's workday, access to the outdoors, to light, to nature. A big part of this trend was the tech offices. Everybody kind of laughed at the Google office or the beanbag office at first, but they understood early that to entice people to come to the work environment, to entice them to be creative and think differently and talk to each other in ways that they may have never before, you need to create the space for that. So we've seen many companies all the way to banking really take up this same kind of tech office approach. And while some implementations might be more appropriate for some than others, we're really seeing these workplaces also, become places that allow employees to even be childlike and have fun. And there is a huge range in what you can do in the space and what makes sense for a particular workplace. But we really just every year kind of see those boundaries shift a little bit.
Yeah, and as we see those boundaries shift, it's important to recognize that the future of the workplace doesn't necessarily need to be defined by one of these trends that Cristina has highlighted. Really, it's all about this spectrum of flexibility. We're seeing people rely on traditional spaces, maybe short-term workspaces, or even shift into co-working or workspace on demand models. And now, naturally, a lot of us have transitioned into work from home, at least temporarily. And so this range of flexibility can be something that doesn't have to be viewed isolated. It can actually be viewed as something that you can leverage together in your future workplace, depending on how you situate yourselves, how you situate your employees, and how you want everyone to interact with each other. And as Cristina was mentioning, there are a number of trends that have been pre-existing in the workplace ecosystem. COVID maybe hasn't been as much of a disruptor as we once thought. Really, it changed our mindset. But in terms of what the workplace as a core system should be focused on, a lot of those trends have simply been accelerated. And so as we're looking in to the opportunities that arise from this rethink, it's really that we need to remember that disruptions can actually often motivate more aspirational behaviors. It can enable people to be uncomfortable and forced to question things, which actually spawns innovation. And because of that, this flexibility that people are striving for might actually be something that we can achieve more sufficiently and effectively. This demand to redefine what the office is should be something that is celebrated, not necessarily feared, because people maybe are more productive than we once thought they could be at home. And we need to embrace what we can do with that and how we can maximize the workplace itself. Something that's been particularly fascinating over the last few months is our conversations with CXOs around the world. We've heard that really this kind of enterprise agility, as we've coined it, has become a really strong strength for organizations. And CXOs are proud of their agility because maybe, as we were just saying, they didn't think that they could go digital, or they didn't think that their employees could all be work from home. But the fact that we could go practically overnight to a digital model is incredible. And a lot of enterprise leaders have really looked back on that with high hopes for the future. Additionally, hierarchies are starting to be broken down. And because of that, the decision-making layers that are embedded in those hierarchies have also been called to question. And that's raised this notion of whether network-based teams might actually be more effective. And what does that mean to how we're delivering outcomes and how we're approaching processes? And beyond that, when we zoom into actually getting work done and what workplace activities look like, there's been a shift in where they need to happen and how they need to happen. Maybe we once thought that a two-person meeting had to be in physical proximity to one another, and we had to be close and we had to be really in the same room. But now, as you can see on the screen, it's shifted all the way to the upper right-hand side of this matrix where it can be virtual. We can be far away and still have a coherent conversation. And so what this has done is really turned the workplace on its head in terms of where activities need to happen, how we can design for them, and how we need to really just change the way we think about the workplace as a physical environment. And so here you'll see 4 key trends that have been accelerated. And primarily in this conversation, Cristina and I are going to be focusing on sustainability and wellness, but they all relate to one another. With change and flexibility, it's really all about this choice and control over where, how, and when we work. I'm sure you've probably discovered that maybe you're more productive in different times and different days and different environments than you ever thought. And maybe that's forced you to rethink where you want to work going forward and how you want to celebrate that. This need for collaboration has rose to the top. The desire to go back to the workplace because of COVID, we've heard across all of our surveys and polls and webinars that it's for in-person meetings and to celebrate culture and to have those casual interactions and pass by meetings in the hallways. And then clearly technology is going to be critical if we are going to actually celebrate the fact that we can be in different places and that we're going to push forward in this really innovative model. But then to tie all of them together, this need to ensure occupant health and well-being, it used to maybe be a maximum and something that you could strive for, but now it's just a bare minimum. We all recognize that our environments impact our health and our safety, but more so, it's also about our feelings of inclusion and feelings of being safe. And that goes beyond simply COVID. It goes to your overall well-being.
Great. Thanks, Amy. So just looking a little bit more into wellness in the workplace, because this is something that, one change I think we can all agree on is that workplaces will have more of a responsibility in the health and wellness of people than ever before. So as Amy was saying, it's something that's now kind of a given that this needs to be looked at. I think with COVID, it's just even more of a magnifying glass. So just to give you an idea of how we think about wellness, some people might know the stat that we spend 90% of our lives indoors. And that's definitely, that percentage has increased during these times. But specific to the work environment, it's cited that 67% of people have health and wellness issues that are related to the workplace environment, whether that be issues related to sleep, even tobacco use, movement, nutrition. 67% of people have health issues related to this. And this is something that we can really respond to in the built environment. And as many know, the Well Building Standard came out. This is another key piece of that evolution of the workplace, and something that COVID is helping to move forward as well. And when we look at these are the features involved in the Well Building Standard, everything from air purity to the materials to use to sound. At Entro, we really see our place as kind of the four on the right there. We see ourselves as involved in encouragement of healthy behaviors related to nourishment. Wayfinding, which I'll explain in a few minutes, is heavily related to movement, how we move through space, and even how we encourage more active movements. Of course, the mind, and then how we nurture a sense of community in the environment.
And so while you're really embracing the fact that the workplace can support your wellness, it's not only about facilitating that well-being and addressing concerns and reducing risks, it's about communicating how you're doing that to your employees. Because as we were just kind of alluding to, as we're returning to the office and navigating this new landscape of what the workplace means, how to communicate with your employees is becoming even more prevalent. We need to focus on clarity, we need to focus on transparency. And on the next slide, we'll talk about really the fact that people need to know what to expect and what is expected of them. So this is where policies and different communications tactics come in. If you're shifting how people need to navigate around your space, or people are expected to actually clock in or use different technologies and tools, they need to know that. Otherwise, it's a lot to ask of them if they don't even know what's being asked. So we're going to touch on a few different ways in which we can amplify our communications and really be clear with employees such that they have a sense of inclusion and a continued assurance of safety while also just enjoying the new space. So first, when you're looking at how the space should be used, because of COVID, there's been a need to evaluate desk utilization strategies. Primarily, there's been an emphasis on the 6-foot disting, 9-foot disting, whatever you're using as that distancing measure. But really, with that and with this acceleration of work from home, there's a need to evaluate maybe how many desks do you need? What is the ownership of those desks? And if those are changing, we need to communicate those. Then as we were starting to look at with navigational tactics and other mobility and cleaning protocols, employees need to know whether or not they should or should not engage with certain areas, or whether there's new ways in which that they need to clean up after themselves, whether it be clean desk policies or even how to interact with the new cafe space. Those are all, they might seem minor, but critical to the overall effectiveness of the workplace. And then finally, not only is this a one-way communication recommendation, but really we need to survey our employees themselves to understand what they want and what they're expecting, because that way you can better curate your own policies and communications to be something that not only accommodates their needs, but that's actually leveraged maximally for the activities that they want to do in the space. So if you are potentially already returned or thinking about returning soon, I'm sure you're thinking maybe people might come in on different days. Maybe I'll do Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or Tuesday, Thursday, or maybe I'll do only the mornings and other people will come in the evenings. Because of COVID, that's been about reducing interactivity and reducing conflict and collisions in the workplace. But going forward, it's actually something that can enable better flexibility for work-life balance. It can enable people to choose where and how they work at a level that maybe they couldn't even imagine previously. And so we must provide a backbone to those kinds of staggered returns and new types of utilization. We have to not only have those policies, but you can actually change the way the space is situated to communicate itself. I started to talk about maybe we're sharing desks or maybe ownership is shifting, but shared desking is something that shouldn't be looked at lightly. There's different ratios that can be embraced and deployed in your space depending on the actual real estate utilization you have and depending on the job functions within your organization. If people are more knowledge worker based or they really have identified that they are heads down focused workers, perhaps they are more suited for work from anywhere models. And perhaps that means we can decrease the individual to seat count ratio. And you'll see how on the right side that impacts the overall square footage and real estate needs of the workplace. As you increase the number of desks per person, you need more space. If you decrease that, naturally you save space, and really the ROI benefits speak for themselves. And then finally, in this kind of policy communication realm, we wanted to emphasize additionally this neighborhood amenity model concept, something that didn't necessarily just get invented. It's actually been in existence for quite some time now in the workplace strategy world, but it's something that it has been leveraged because of COVID in order to lessen the amount of spaces that people interact with. You can start to curate maybe different groups of people for different sectors of the floor plate or different sectors of the workplace to not only give them a sense of ownership and welcome in their environment, but to also be able to track and trace who's interacting with what. So in the lens of COVID, we can maximize cleaning and we can maximize maintenance because we know that people have been there or they have not. And then looking forward, people can really just make the most of their own neighborhood and get close to that little sense that they can call their workplace.
Great. And the neighborhood model really relates a lot to what we do in the built environment and how we visualize that. So I wanted to take you through wayfinding and placemaking as it relates to this well standard. So as I mentioned, we're really looking at it from these four areas in the work that we do. We see these areas as related to these broader concepts, which are human delight, celebration of culture and place, meaningful integration of art, the access to nature, spatial familiarity, and encouraging healthy behaviors. So that's how we see the power of graphics in the workplace. And what that really boils down to is understanding and impact. On the more placemaking side, it's how we interpret our environment, how the brand of an organization or company is expressed, and how individuals in the environment understand that, how we can convey our values that are true to our core and that we want the people in our space to feel as well. And how do we provide those opportunities for interaction, for collaboration? Because as some companies are choosing whether to send people back or how many to send people back, the question becomes, what is the importance of the environment now, the workplace environment? If we don't need to be there completely, what are we going to use that space for so that it does, provide the most return on investment, so that we do get the most value out of that? So we hear a lot of experts talking about rethinking the space to be more collaborative, more spaces for connection, things that you can't get at home. And then the right side of this is really, okay, how do you find your way through that environment? How do you orient yourself? How do you know where you are? How do you find your way to other places? How do you direct yourselves? How do you identify certain areas? And then of course, there's a lot of safety, regulation, and accessibility involved. And so spatial familiarity, which is a concept that comes out of the well building standard, how we can really support this is we can create zones. So that relates a little bit to what Amy was talking about. We can create zones in the environment so that not everything necessarily has to have a big sign or label on it. We can actually use color, lighting, art features, and other strategies to really create different sections or zones of the office. It's involved in your intimacy and familiarity of the space. You should feel like you know that space, that you know how to get around. Of course, wayfinding and orientation. There should be a balance between cohesion and distinction. So some features or communications should stand out, but some should also nicely fit in with the architectural treatment, which I know is very important to this group, that we don't, take over from the beautiful architecture that's there already or that has certain purposes, but also that things still can have their place. And then another key component in spatial familiarity is pronouncing those thresholds and those new areas so that people know. And this is particularly important as we look at the immediate COVID return. There might be certain areas, as Amy mentioned, that maybe we are putting people in, whether it's related to just actual COVID safety, or if it's that you're reusing the space and maybe now one area has a completely different purpose and you're really being strategic. So wayfinding and familiarity and understanding of space will become so much more important as the workplaces will shift to ones that maybe are constantly flexible, have different uses, or just are trying to maintain a certain health and safety standard. And so just to dig in a little bit into what wayfinding is, again, I'm sure this group, being a group of architects, really understands wayfinding. But for the others that are watching, so wayfinding is really the way we orient ourselves and navigate through space. And when we design a system at Entro, it's really the process of defining path and place. So not only where are we, but how do we get through the space? And this can be some of the more obvious examples, such as directories, level identification. This is where we get more into creating overall treatments for the space. So you can see that this is a color coordinated space. It's using cardinal directions, and it's also at the same time brightening up the space. Again, using large art features or bands that can also at the same time, while providing some sort of orientation, it can also encourage things like stair use. If there's large features, it's seen as something or is proven to be something that encourages people to use the stairs, where elevators might be the other option. And that gets a little bit more into kind of nudging people towards more of those active, healthy behaviors. It can be large scale sculptural elements that bring attention to a space or create a sort of landmark. In some of our research, we do these things called cognitive sketch maps to understand how people perceive their own area and how they would tell somebody to get through a space. And often it's these large landmarks that people most often remember rather than street names or general directions. It can be large lighting features, things that cause some difference or you can point to, or just create an overall sense of place or sense of feeling of space. Also, wayfinding and placemaking, it can also provide opportunities maybe in hallways or areas that might just be passing through areas to communicate those values, or to provide imagery that can give a sense of calm, a sense of break from the day, and even bring in those elements of biophilia, bringing nature into the space in other ways than just bringing plants in, which is a wonderful way, but there are many strategies to bring nature into a space. So really, when we're thinking about returning to the workplace, it's really what is that dialogue between the person and their environment, and how does the space communicate? And rather than how we think people move and perceive their space, it's often we'll consult with a company like Plastarck or do a lot of stakeholder engagement with our clients to really understand, okay, how are they actually moving through the space and perceiving the space? Often it can be a little bit different than we would expect. One of the ways we're looking at this now, and it's especially important as we talk to clients about the post-COVID workplace, is looking into that understanding through technology. So understanding how they move through the space through pedestrian flow simulation, which really is taking user data, putting it through space, doing things like heat mapping and seeing where those bottlenecks might occur, where major decision points are, maybe where there are certain amenities or things like that, where we do see a lot of pileup of people. So this can tell us not only how we might want to encourage different ways of flowing through the space, but where there might need to be signage to enable that, signage that either very explicitly tells people where to go or where not to go, or might give occupancy limits or things like that when we're speaking specifically to COVID. or some of those more intuitive cues that can kind of zone out areas, or just, it's interesting, as when we started with COVID, we all had to have on these dots, and many still do, but keep 6 feet apart, or specific recommendations. And now we're seeing, as we see more and more kind of design interventions come in, just a dot on the floor, people know, or a dot on a seat means you can only sit there. There's a lot of things that have become a lot more intuitive.
Yeah, and Christina, I personally love your pedestrian flow model. I think it's an exceptional example of a way in which technology can be used to not only create that relationship between people and buildings, but showcase that maybe we can not only predict what people can do, but we can predict problems in design, which I think really elevates what designers can do today. I think something else that's critical in this kind of technology realm is that we need to recognize all of the systems within buildings beyond just HVAC and space planning, that people themselves are a system. They have different activities, they have different levels of interactions, and even their presence itself is a system that can be measured and can be quantified. And you can use technology to really to get connected with what those different activities and interactions are doing in your space. Then the building itself, all the systems and spaces and furniture, those also all can be quantified and incorporated into this digital layer. And then the data that emerges from both of those inputs and output systems can be used to not only measure agility, but to even empower your employees to get more engaged in the design process. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see that there's a number of ways that you can leverage existing data in your workplace. You might have badge swipe access to your building. You might have different Wi-Fi network logs. You might even have a workplace experience app. I'm sure the number one use case here that is emerging is really this need to have room and seat booking and sensor technology. The capacity for those sorts of sensors in order to facilitate and streamline utilization and negate any COVID risk has really come to the forefront. But beyond that, you'll see here there's a whole other swath of technologies that you might already have that you can leverage to measure your own agility. And when we're talking about agility, I wanted to clarify 4 key terms that we utilize and that I recommend that you either deploy or at least think about in your workplace or in your design work. When we're talking about occupancy, this is not only just in the building. It's not just, are they on site? It's also, where are they? What floors are they using? Are there particular multisensory variables that are leading their choices to go there? Do they feel more comfortable, or is it more a community feel that's driving that occupancy? And then when you shift into desk utilization, that's really at the granular level. What desks are being occupied? How often are they occupied? And what activities are taking place at those desks? Is it perhaps not what you designed them for, or not what you thought they would be used for? When we're talking about meeting room utilization, what we hear a lot from clients is that people book a room, but they don't show up, or they book a room and they leave early. And so really understanding the size of meeting rooms that are being used, how long they're being used, and how many people are doing what can maximize the meeting rooms and other amenity spaces that you provide. And then finally, you can actually use data and technology and put sensors on your equipment themselves. You can understand call times, you can understand locations, connectivity, and you can actually start to assess, maybe are there pieces of equipment that are underutilized, or ones that are always taken, and maybe you need to buy more of them to enable your employees to have everything that they need. And then as we start to flip the conversation, and it's less of a managerial perspective and more of a user experience perspective, there's also a way to measure and count space usage and use that to inform future developments in your design. We look at the workplace as something that should be an ongoing conversation and should constantly be reassessed and evaluated in order to make it as resilient as possible. When you range from heads down seats to collaborative seats, people want different things. They might want something for one activity and something else for another. So we can start to look at different work styles in different spaces, whether it's actually conducive to good focused work, Or maybe it's a space for a break. Maybe it's a space to actually get some of that mental time to yourself and to step away from your work. But by evaluating the level of connection, how bookable they are, and how frequently they're used, we can start to quantify the mobility of employees and give people more choice within the workplace. Something else that we're seeing that starts to spread from the retail environment, I want to say, into the workplace is this rise of workplace consumerization and the need to maybe have high performance, on demand, and communicative buildings. And so I want to encourage all of you to look into how maybe the building itself can be more communicative through technology display systems. In this use case here, you see Safe by Density, which is a platform that they deployed to be able to show people how occupied, how available the workspace is because of COVID. You can feel safe knowing, okay, there's only 10% of the floor is occupied. That's exactly where people are. I can go over there and have no fear. But then going forward, you can also start to use that to evaluate, maybe you need more space for what you're doing, or maybe you want to be in the bustle of the workplace. And so being able to communicate that data with employees gives them more confidence and gives them more of a feel that they know what to expect, that they can look forward to. When we're talking about workplace consumerization, there's also this need to emphasize preferences. And it's not something that should be biased against. It's not something that should be viewed from a forced objective manner. We should really embrace how subjective people are and that this flexibility can come down to the individual person's level. And so in order to enable change and flexibility, we can actually start to even look at our cell phones. We can look at all of the apps that you have, whether you are using them to communicate with your friends or checking LinkedIn or ordering food for lunch. All of those apps have different trace data, and that's informed a new line of digital technology for workplaces that can be leveraged, and I highly recommend you do so going forward. One in particular is on the next slide. Well, these are just a few apps that deliver services and offer. If we actually go to the next one, this is an example called Comfy. Comfy is an app that you can download and connect to your building systems, where maybe in the design process, you typically only think of technology in the project delivery phase, or maybe even in construction, but rarely do we really embrace the fact that it can go beyond that. It can go to the interaction with temperature, with lighting, all of the environmental qualities that foster different feelings of safety and wellness. Those can be controlled by the individual. They don't have to be something from the top down. So this is an example of how to enable occupant control over different aspects by putting it into the hands of the users.
Okay. So this last piece is really just about the more intuitive cues we talked about before, how as symbols and communications become understood over time, the less and less information you need. So there might be more intuitive strategies that tap into just our more kind of unconscious behavior and understanding that can be used, because as we look at, and we're speaking about this both in the post-COVID and the future environment, in the immediate post-COVID environment, what you don't want is people feeling so nervous in the workplace by all these, a bunch of tape on the floor or a bunch of signage that maybe could be simplified or communicated in a different way, that just overwhelms people throughout their day and distracts from enjoying their experience in the environment and being productive and interacting with their colleagues. So there's a lot of value in, as much as possible, just trying to find those more intuitive cues. I'll pass it over to Amy.
Yeah, we love intuition at both Plastarck and Entro. We think it's so core to what makes us human. And we can actually start to use that as a design tactic as well. And so this slide is really just to say that maybe when we were looking at technology and we were looking at policies and communication as space management or operationally, we can start to shift the conversation towards people enablement even more strongly when we're looking at different space types and how to make the space itself diverse. And so if we go into this array of different space types, you're probably familiar with all of them, but maybe you haven't thought about them in terms of work styles. So there's typically the sit down desk area or your individual office that are allocated for heads down focus work. But then with regards to collaboration, what we see frequently is that there might be one collab zone, or you might be recontextualizing your workstations to facilitate collaboration, but providing a variety of different alternative space types that can become more heads down or collaborative, depending on the person's preferences, can facilitate this kind of conversation throughout the space and can encourage more movement and more opportunities for wayfinding. There's also support spaces that can be embraced, like even standing height storage spaces to save room and make it more about the user experience and less about this space and storage, but really just understanding that a diversity of spaces can help to not only encourage a diversity of cognition, but to recognize that intuition is individual. And so as you're kind of curating and thinking through what is the space type diversity that is right for you, or what is good for your clients, or any particular use case, there's a way in which we can actually start to calculate and tailor needs based on profiles of a different company or an organization, based on the different collaborative percentage of work or the actual work that you're doing. You can start to think through, okay, how large do spaces need to be? How tech-centric? What are all the ingredients that feed into this particular activity? And how can we maximize our space and our ratios to best suit those needs? And then if we really are getting a little bit more wayfindy here, we can think about activity-based working. This is taking the diversity of space types that I was just talking about and thinking about how they can be situated in a way that encourages movement and encourages mobility. It's not just about saying go from point A to point B in the workplace and you know exactly where you're going, but this visibility into the diversity of space can not only foster this desire to navigate, but it can also increase interactions, innovation, and happenstance encounters that people might not have otherwise. And so you'll see this comparison between a traditional environment, which maybe just has offices or meeting rooms and desks, to this really activated and engaging space where you might actually just happen upon something, or you might have a hideaway space that you like to keep at 3 in the afternoon or whatever. But having those variable spaces can be so conducive to a healthy environment. And so here's just a few key physical health benefits for ABW, but really I want to stress that activity-based working can be something that benefits not only your physical health, but your mental health and your organizational health. When we're looking at physical health in the context that Cristina started to illustrate before, we can look at how ABW nudges you towards not only traveling between areas, but trying to go and interact with different people or different support spaces. It basically provides options for movement that enables and stimulates brain function. And so because of that, we find a direct correlation between workplaces that adopt ABW and organizations that have improved creativity, improved problem-solving abilities, and just improved satisfaction with the workplace. It's not something that we say lightly, and ABW is not new. It's been around for years, but it's something that is now more than ever something that you can definitely celebrate and leverage in this moment. And then finally, still in the ABW realm, but really just in the workplace model, we tie back to the neighborhood model that we started to talk about earlier. But this is taking all the diverse space types and thinking about them within the neighborhood. How do they come together? And what is the scale of this? So as opposed to thinking of the workplace as a whole and just having meeting rooms in one sector or just having office spaces in one sector, it's about the ratio between work points and away seats, as well as the visibility into those spaces so that people really feel active and feel encouraged and comfortable in their environment.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about how we visualize this, or how do we help through experiential graphic design achieve some of the goals that Amy's laid out. One being this idea of different neighborhoods or areas in the office that you want people to use differently, but also those other healthy behaviors such as healthy eating, fitness, and even when we think about COVID, obviously distancing, hygienic behaviors and things like that. So I just wanted to show you some examples that really don't use explicit language to try to have different behaviors. It's that nudging. It's something that you don't really notice, or maybe it seems more fun or just an artistic expression, but what it really is doing is kind of sneaking its way into your cognition and trying to really encourage those behaviors. So just a few examples. So this little pictogram here is of the way that one of our clients has their office laid out. And really this was a way that we worked with the architect to plan the space so that these different neighborhoods or areas, and this was particularly important for this client too, because for some services, you could only enter through certain parts of the buildings and they wanted to dissuade people from going to other areas. But it was really about color coding these areas through lighting, through graphics, signage, and through color treatments. So you'll see here, it's how this picture here gets realized. So you'll see that there's more of a green section, a blue section, and then different areas that bring it through. And that's carried all the way through to stairwells, the graphics that also kind of brighten the stairwells as well. And you'll see that every area really stays true to that color treatment. And so it provides this way of knowing where you are in the building, first and foremost, but also knowing where to go, what area is designated for each. And then it also just provides some individuality to the space. When we think about COVID specifically, this is just one that came out with our partner. It was a bit more of a visualization, but these are actually distancing graphics on the ground. But as you can see, as we as a population have learned what it means to see kind of two similar shapes on the ground that are far apart, we kind of know, okay, there's some distance instruction being implied here. So this is just somewhere that's a more abstract, more visually pleasing way to suggest distance. And then when we get into these nudging of maybe more active behaviors, use of stairwells, this is for another client, this was for the YW, but really we use these fun kind of emoticon graphics that encourage, they have people doing active behaviors, and then as you go up the stairs, it actually tells you kind of how many calories you've burned and all that, and you know, some very encouraging graphics around that. On the right side, it's more just an overall encouraging message, bright colors. Again, just making stairwells, especially, stairways are commonly known to be not very beautiful spaces. They can be pretty drab or dark. And so just brightening those up, leaving something there to discover can encourage more use of them. And then when we get into healthy eating, this is actually for our client Sobeys. They really wanted to celebrate the joy of healthy eating. And so really it was just through using graphics as well as line drawings of different produce, both in the cafeteria areas, but also at every level, right by the elevator lobbies. And again, it's not saying eat healthy or use the stairs or stay apart or use only this area. It's really, again, just using color and graphics and design to encourage them.
Awesome. I was so captivated by those images, Cristina. I almost forgot we were still going. But yeah, we're just going to bring it to a close by pulling all of this together and re-emphasizing what Cristina said early on, that when you're thinking about the future of work and just design in general, there's this need to think about all the different stakeholders and all the different pieces that are coming together. And it's much more productive to integrate and to work together at the get-go than to try and put things together later on that weren't designed to fit into a nice puzzle. And so as we're thinking about all of the user needs in the moment of COVID, and we're thinking about how to be safe and healthy and equitable in how we are returning to the workplace, our team at Plastarck put together this 10-step roadmap. And it starts at really accounting for factors outside of your control, stretching into once you acknowledge what's beyond the walls of your office and what's not in your control, and look at what is. We might think about policies determining who needs to come back, how to really leverage flexibility and diversity, but then how to assess building preparedness, how to look at spaces like pantries and cafes and building technology. And then all in all, how do you build trust and transparency and perhaps even look at long-term teleworking? So all of these pieces were laid out in our roadmap, and we really saw how complex the problem was, but how many variables and individuals must need to come into the conversation.
Yeah, and so this collaboration is really, it's really, we say viewing necessities as opportunities. So things that may have been seen as, okay, we need to get this in to be able to meet this code or meet this credential or certification, or in the case of COVID, to enable safety, we should be, if we work together, we can really view those as opportunities to innovate. As we've talked about a lot here, including the space occupants as stakeholders. So when we think about collaboration, it's not only between firms, but it's really between those that use the space, so employees, and their bosses, and then that relates to us who are helping their bosses really create nice spaces. So it's this interconnection between users of the space, our clients whose spaces they are, and us as the experts. And then when it comes to working together as firms, it's really combining our methods, materials, disciplines, expertise, and key is starting early with everyone at the table, as Amy mentioned.
Yeah, and so something that we wanted to share in case you were not aware is that Entro and Plastarck are two members of what we've coined the Workwell Coalition. This coalition is an example of 8 or 9 or maybe even more at this point, firms coming together to work and leverage all of our diverse capabilities in order to actually create holistic workplace renewals. And this was originally spawned by the 10-step roadmap in response to COVID. But what we've really gleaned as a collective is that the future of work needs to focus on wellness. And there are ways in which we can catalyze this disruption in order to transform the entire conversation. And so we're working together in this fashion. And here you'll just see, this is a diagram of how our different services come together within the roadmap. And you see that there isn't one team that does all of it. Really, we are so dispersed between our focuses, whether they're engineering, interior design, landscape, architecture, wayfinding, and strategy. And so all of these pieces come together, and by working together, we can make sure that each piece of the roadmap and each piece of the workplace is addressed effectively, but also equitably.
We only have
Thank you.
couple minutes there for questions. So one of the first questions we have here that we've received from clients is, are you seeing an evolution in your clients' thinking on return to the workplace and their priorities? Amy, I'll shoot this one at you, just to put you on the spot.
All right, I'll take it. I'm actually curious how your clients' thinking has changed too, but on our end, the way that we've talked about it within our team is less that our clients' thinking has changed and more that the appetite for what we do has changed. I think the services we deliver and that we've always advocated for are for collaboration. They're for effective workplaces. They're for innovation that is not only centered on wellness, but looking at just integral team collaboration. And so how to foster that was always something that we've been talking about, but now there's this acceleration of desire for a workplace that can be hybridized. Maybe there's this need for tech more than it ever was. And I think if there was a shift in our clients' thinking, it was definitely more towards technology, understanding how the building can be more tech enabled and how they can get feedback from their employees without having to have a million conversations.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely similar to what we're seeing. I think in the immediate term, it's really how do we bring people back, but make them feel safe and communicate clearly, you know, our expectations of of the place and how we can all kind of serve those greater health needs together. Um, we are hearing a lot about the workplaces being used for different purposes. So um, for the offices that may downsize, how much space do we need and what are the wayfinding implications of that to be able to bring people in on a more flexible schedule basis? And speaking of that flexibility, how do we create and communicate for spaces that might be used for different things? Another big one is just what we're looking at with the pedestrian flow simulation, which is how do we get people through a space? How many people can we get through in this long of a time? This is certainly more applicable to larger workplaces and larger environments in general. But how do we move people through and make it clear, both from a wayfinding, but also just visual standpoint of where they can and cannot go. Pictograms we're being asked a lot about. There's a lot of new pictograms to bring into the space. And then I think there is this piece that is people are comfortable working from home. How do we make our places, our spaces more appealing to people? How do we make it feel like they have some ownership over it, or it expresses some of their individuality and culture, especially as we look at recent things that have happened related to diversity and inclusion in that case. So how does the workplace become some place that people feel like it represents them or speaks to them, maybe in the same way that their home can, to really entice people to come back in? Because I think a lot of workplaces still see a lot of value in people being together in a space. So I see we've went over. So yeah, maybe we'll just sign off there.
Yeah, I think we're good. Thanks,
Okay.
everyone.
Thank you.